so-called discoveries where we discuss stories, knowledge, and insights from somewhere and try to learn something. My name is Anthony Ozzie, and today's episode is a discussion on the book The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. It is an iconic piece of work that was first published in 1923. It's filled with much poetic wisdom and reflection on many universally human topics that many, if not all of us, go through. Life, love, marriage, children, giving, work, what you do when you're feeling sorrowful, what you're doing when you're feeling joyful, death, prayer. Many of these universal themes are going to come up in this book. So I am going to give a quick background on the author, Kahlil Gibran, and then a little bit of background on the book, The Prophet, and from then start reading certain excerpts and passages from the book itself, and then provide some commentary and points of discussion. I encourage you to consider your own life experiences when you're listening to the passages that I'm going to be reading, because although it came out over 100 years ago, it truly is timeless. It is very relevant to the human experience still in the modern world. Let's talk a little bit about the author before we get started. Gibran was born in Lebanon in 1883, and his mother and his siblings immigrated from Lebanon to the United States in 1895, so when he was around 12 years old, and he went to a school in Boston. And then about 3 years later, at the age of 15, he was sent back to Lebanon by his family. And then about 4 or so years after that, he left Lebanon again and returned to Boston. So from birth until age 19, his life was basically split between Lebanon and Boston. So Gibran began writing The Prophet around 1912, and it was published for the first time in English in 1923, and he died in 1931 at the age of 48. The Prophet is his best-known work. It is one of the best-selling books of all time. It's been translated into over 100 languages, and it has never gone out of print. The book is structured in a series of poetic reflections on various aspects of life. It tells the story of a prophet named Almustafa. He has lived in a fictional city called Orphalese for 12 years. It's not his hometown, but he's been there for 12 years. In the beginning of the book, it states that he's been there for 12 years, and now a ship has come, and it's time for him to actually return home. As he's getting ready to board the ship and go home, he's stopped by a number of people from the city, from the town of Orphalese. And they all stop him and they say, you're leaving. Oh, we're going to miss you. And, we don't want you to leave. We love you so much. Before you leave, can you just talk to us about some things? Can you teach us some things? Tell us about the human condition. And they start asking him various questions, and then he responds. And that's essentially how the book is divided up. The first chapter is him about to leave, and then the people stop him. The remaining chapters, except for the last, are just them asking him about a particular aspect of life and then him giving them his thoughts about it. And then the final chapter is he says this long farewell and leaves them with his final thoughts and final goodbye before he departs on the ship. So some of the themes that you can expect to hear and sort of look for and listen for, there's certainly an element of spirituality that comes into this. That said, he doesn't specify any given religion. He doesn't confine his discussion on spirituality to any sort of a religion. You're also going to hear certain themes about balance and various dualities. He gives his thoughts on freedom and individuality. He's going to encourage the listener, the audience, to sort of move towards self-discovery and self-knowledge, and puts an emphasis on allowing yourself to grow. And then also one of the themes to sort of listen for is this theme of interconnectedness and like universality, that we're all part of this greater thing, this common unity. So with that, let's get into it. Let's get into the book and start reading some excerpts and do a little bit of a discussion on it. Definitely not the whole book. Just going to pull out a few pieces that I like, that I think are relevant, and demonstrate some of the key principles that Gibran wants to get across. So the first chapter is titled The Coming of the Ship. This is essentially when he's waiting for his ship to arrive. He's been in the city for 12 years. Once he sees that his ship has arrived, he's at first very excited and very happy, and then he feels a bit of a sadness come onto him. And now I'll read from the book. How shall I go in peace and without sorrow? Nay, without a word in the spirit shall I leave this city. Long were the days of pain I have spent within its walls, and long were the nights of aloneness. And who can depart from his pain and his aloneness without regret? Too many fragments of the spirit have I scattered in these streets, and too many are the children of my longing that walk naked among these hills, and I cannot withdraw them without a burden and an ache. It is not a garment I cast off this day, but a skin that I tear with my own hands. So here, just as he's getting ready to depart, he's been excitedly waiting for his ship to arrive. And now he's starting to feel the weight of what's happening. It's not a trivial thing. He's going through a departure, but this is also, based off how he's describing it, symbolizing a transformation for the character Almustafa. That's why he says, "It is not a garment I cast off this day, but a skin that I tear with my own hands." It's not a minor change. It's not something superficial like taking off your garments or your clothes. He's actually tearing off his own skin. And it can be sort of painful in this sort of transformative process. And he has this bittersweet reflection where he's excited that it's time to move on, but now that it's time, he didn't really realize the depth of his bond with this city and the people there. And if we sort of relate this to the modern life, if you've ever left a job where you've been there for a long time, or you've lived in a city for a while, now you're moving to a new place, or you have a relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship, and then for whatever reason it's ending and you both need to move on. Any sort of life change like this, it can feel not only like shedding clothes, it can feel like actually shedding your skin. And it can be quite painful. And even if you're excited for the next phase and for the next chapter, you can feel a little bit of sorrow and attachment to the thing that you're about to leave, the thing you're about to move on from. And sometimes you don't realize how deep your connection with that thing was and how important it actually was to you until you're at the point where you're actually ready to leave. One of the other things he says that he needs to leave, he needs to go on, even though he feels this attachment to this place. And he says, "For to stay, though the hours burn in the night, is to freeze and crystallize and be bound in a mold." So he's saying, it's time to go. Like, as much as I'm feeling this attachment, I actually do need to leave because otherwise I'll be stagnant. I'll be static. It's time for me to grow. We can relate this to how we feel about certain things sometimes when you're sort of clinging to a familiar routine or a familiar pattern. Even if that pattern or routine doesn't serve you as well as it used to, or maybe it's even destructive, you really would benefit from moving on and growing and adapting something else. It can still be painful and difficult to make that change. And even though you know intellectually making that change would be good for you, be beneficial, you still struggle to do it. So as he's going on his way to walk towards the ship, the various people of the town come up to him and they begin freaking out and worrying that he's about to leave and they don't want him to leave. So again, that kind of goes to what I was saying before. Sometimes you don't truly understand how important something is or how much you love something until you're at that point where you're about to lose it. We should keep that in mind as we reflect on our relationships. For example, if you have a relationship romantically and you're not treating it with the proper attention or respect it deserves, and you think like, I don't care about this thing, it's not that important, there are other priorities that I have. Eventually, once you get to the point where you've separated from that relationship, you may begin to think, oh, this actually was pretty important to me, and now I'm feeling a lot of pain. And you may think that in a work situation, maybe you feel like, I don't care about this job, I can find another job. And so you sort of phone it in, you don't work hard, you don't give it your all. And then eventually, maybe you don't get promoted, or even worse, maybe you get fired or laid off. You may have some of those same thoughts. Well, man, this job actually was pretty important to me, and now it's gone. I wish I would have treated it with more respect and put more of myself into it. So the people are saying all these things. Then eventually this woman comes out named Almitra. And Almitra says, "Prophet of God, in quest of the uttermost, long have you searched the distances for your ship. And now your ship has come, and you must needs go. Deep is your longing for the land of your memories and the dwelling place of your great desires. And our love would not bind you, nor our needs hold you." She's basically saying to him, you need to go. We know you need to go. Then she says, "Yet this we ask ere you leave us, that you speak to us and give us of your truth, and we will give it unto our children, and they unto their children, and it shall not perish." So she's saying basically, please give us your wisdom, give us your truth, and we're going to pass it down through the generations. We're going to cherish them and teach them to each other and teach them to our future generations. "Now, therefore, disclose us to ourselves and tell us all that has been shown you of that which is between birth and death." She's basically saying, you've been here, you've been witnessing us, you've been seeing us, you've been observing us for 12 years and interacting with us for 12 years. So tell us what you see about us and ourselves. Give us your insights. Give us your final thoughts about us and our city and our people. And Al-Mustafa, the prophet, responds, "People of Orphalese, of what can I speak, save of that which is even now moving within your souls?" So now he's essentially asking them, he's like, okay, you want me to say something to you. So tell me. What is it that I can say to you? What can I speak to you? So he has a bit of humility there. He's not just going to start preaching and saying, this is what you need to know. He's saying, what do you want to know? You lead the conversation and I'll respond. That gets us off into the entire book. The entire book is various members of the city of Orphalese prompting him, asking him questions, and he gives them his thoughts and responses on whatever they ask. Now, the next chapter is called On Love. Each of the chapters, except for the first chapter and the last chapter, are on something, on love or on marriage. And they all begin the same way as well. They begin with someone in the town asking him, like, tell us about this. So this one, the first one, on love, begins with Almitra saying, speak to us of love. When love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. And when he speaks to you, believe in him, though his voice may shatter your dreams. For even as love crowns you, so shall he crucify you. Even as he is for your growth, so is he for your pruning. So he offers this duality, this dual nature of love. It elevates you and it crucifies you. It's blissful and feels incredible in many ways. It's also intensely challenging and can come with a lot of pain as well. And he talks about these various transformative things. So he says it's for your growth, but it's also for your pruning. So he's saying that love transforms us. It might cut away certain illusions that we have about the world or our purpose, maybe certain selfish or destructive habits that we might have. And think not you can direct the course of love, for love, if it finds you worthy, directs your course. So don't think that you can control it. Don't think that you can be in charge. Another thing that sort of comes to mind from reading some of the stuff that he talks about here is that real love, if it is true intimate love, is going to require some level of vulnerability. He's basically saying love can destroy you, and he's saying it can crucify you. That comes with a certain amount of vulnerability if you're going to step into that and sort of accept that level of risk. I think it is an acceptance of risk to embrace love, whether it's romantic or platonic. If you love somebody, you inherently are going to care deeply about what happens to that person and about your relationship with that person, your ability to interact and engage with that person. If that person dies or gets hurt or does something to upset you or disrespect you or betrays your trust, these things can be very painful, and it's taking on a big risk to embrace love of another person. Now, the next thing that the people ask him about is marriage. It seems kind of natural stemming off of love. Some of the themes that he talks about for marriage is that you need to have some space in the togetherness. Marriage is a union between two people. It's important that you come together, but he says it's also very important that each of the partners sort of remain distinct and maintain their individualism. A healthy marriage isn't going to dissolve the personal identity of either person, and it allows each of the individuals to flourish within the union. So let's read some excerpts. You shall be together even in the silent memory of God, but let there be spaces in your togetherness. Fill each other's cup, but drink not from one cup. So in a marriage, he's saying you share resources, you share experiences, right? You're sharing finances, you're sharing a home, but you can't just have one identity between the two of you. Each partner is going to retain their sort of individual essence. You both give and receive with one another, but you do remain distinct. This is cautioning against codependency when it comes down to it, codependent relationships. You should have synergy with one another, but you don't want to merge your identities. Another metaphor, he says, for the pillars of the temple stand apart. So you're two pillars holding up one temple, but you stand apart. He's talking about making sure that each partner is retaining their individual strengths, their sense of self. Over closeness, over attachment with one another can stifle the mutual growth. It can stifle your growth as individuals, and it can stifle your growth as a union, as a relationship. A true union, a true relationship, a true marriage, it doesn't require erasing entirely your personal boundaries. You can have independence within a relationship and mutual respect for each other within a relationship. You can still support each other, like the pillars are supporting that one temple, but those two pillars don't have to merge into one single block. They can still be two pillars that are supporting that same temple. And that temple can be, you can think of it as your relationship, your union, your mission, your family, your house, however you want to think of it. After marriage, the people ask about children. So it says a woman who has a babe held against her bosom says, speak to us of children. And the first thing that Almustafa says is, your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for itself. They come through you but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. She says, speak to us of children. And he says, your children don't belong to you. They belong to life. They belong to the universe. You are a caretaker for your child, but you don't own your children. And he's essentially saying that they have their own path. You should be supportive as parents. Part of that means letting your children discover themselves rather than imposing your own vision onto your children or imposing your own parental dreams or what you want for them onto them. Allow them to discover themselves and have their own path, their own journey. He then says, you may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you. For life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. He's basically saying a parent can emulate their child's life. You can emulate perhaps your children's perspective. You can be like them, but you shouldn't try to make them like you. You shouldn't force them to replicate the path that you took or the path that you want for them. They are after you. They come after you. They are the future. You can't bring them back to what your path was or make them like you. If anything, you should try and be like them. That's kind of an interesting perspective. But he's basically emphasizing here the forward-looking nature of what comes with youth. And I think this kind of makes sense in a lot of ways. Certain elements of what he's saying, at least there's examples of it where it makes sense. So, in the past few years, people have become more and more familiar with AI, or even if you're not familiar with it, you at least hear about it, and you hear about how it's becoming more prevalent and how it's becoming more useful and that it's going to become more and more involved with the workplace. I studied computer science in school, and at that time, it was widely recognized as a very, very smart decision to study computer science and that it would give you a lot of job prospects. You were going to have a lot of opportunities at making a high income. It was a really good, valid, smart choice. Fast forward to today, a lot of people are starting to say that learning to code, learning a programming language, is actually not as beneficial as it once was. And it's going to become less and less beneficial because you're going to be able to use natural language to communicate with an AI, and then the AI is going to be able to generate the code for you. So it's going to become less important for you to actually know how to code. So I don't have a child, but let's say I did have a child and I were to start saying to that child, I learned computer science and it's worked out really well for me. And I should probably distinguish between computer science and programming. They're related, but they're two different things. Computer science may still be valid, but learning a programming language, potentially that's going to become less and less useful. And it kind of makes sense to me. But anyways, let's say I were to say to my non-existent child, I learned all these programming languages and it's been really beneficial to me. So because it worked for me, this is the path that you should go down. Let's say they invest a lot of time and energy into that. And then when that child is really like entering the workforce or starting to mature in their career, then those skills are just not as relevant or not as valuable anymore. And it's more valuable to learn AI tools. The next chapter is on giving. And it says, a rich man says, speak to us of giving. So Almustafa answers, he says, you give but little when you give of your possessions. It is when you give of yourself that you truly give. So he's saying true generosity essentially is when you give of yourself, when it's more personal. For example, when you give your time or your energy, or if you give empathy. True giving is not from giving possessions, donating money or goods. It's from giving from the essence of who you are. Perhaps you can use your skills to give. Another thing he says is there are those who have little and give it all. These are the believers in life and the bounty of life, and their coffer is never empty. I think he's encouraging people to adopt a mindset of abundance, saying that you should trust in the world or the universe or whatever, and trust that if you give freely, if you're generous, you'll actually experience some return, and that stuff will come back to you. He says your coffer is never empty. So he's like, you'll be fine. You'll be taken care of. Karma will make its way. Also in this chapter on giving, he writes, it is well to give when asked, but it is better to give unasked through understanding. So responding to the needs that someone might have before they actually request anything. He's inviting us to be proactive in our compassion, in our generosity, anticipating the needs of other people out of empathy. And these can be very small, random things. Perhaps you can notice that somebody needs something that is a stranger. It's a complete stranger. It reminds me, one time I was in an elevator a woman got into the elevator with me, and she was wearing medical scrubs. So she was obviously a nurse or a doctor or somebody in the medical field. And she was very clearly coming home from work. And I could just tell from just her appearance and her energy that she was tired and she was stressed. She had a look on her face. She didn't make eye contact with me, and she was kind of looking down the whole time and breathing kind of heavy and sighing. I could just tell from her energy that she had had a rough night. Elevator starts going up, and I just, very simply, I turn my head towards her and I say, "Tough night?" She looks over at me, and her face immediately kind of like lightens a little bit. She smiles and she goes, "Yeah, it was a long night, a really long night." And I was like, "Well, thankfully now you're home. Hopefully you get to de-stress and wind down and relax a little bit." She goes, "Yeah, thankfully." And I could just tell her mood just kind of lightened a little bit. Her face changed. Her energy was a little bit shifted. It was just a very, very simple thing. And, I just noticed that she seemed a little bit off, and giving her just that teeny, teeny, tiny little outlet to just sort of say, "Yeah, I did have a rough night. It was tough, but, I'm home now, thankfully, and I get to relax." I like to think that I made her day just slightly a little bit better. You have no idea what sort of an impact on somebody's day or their mood it might have to, for example, just hold the door open or very clearly and obviously give somebody a smile as you're walking by them. These sort of small, again, non-financial, relatively low-effort contributions that you can offer somebody can, believe it or not, sometimes be transformative in what the experience of their day ends up being, and you can have a pretty solid impact. Also on giving, Gibran writes, "You often say, 'I would give, but only to the deserving.' Surely, he who is worthy to receive his days and his nights is worthy of all else from you." So here he's saying, if somebody is worthy of life, of being a human and being in this world, then they're worthy of whatever you can give to them. It's a matter of having basic decency and respect for humanity. What he's really trying to do here is cultivate within this community a reflex of kindness, like a culture of kindness. Then following up on that, sort of rounding this out, he says, "And who are you that men should rend their bosom and unveil their pride, that you may see their worth naked and their pride unabashed? See first that you yourself deserve to be a giver and an instrument of giving." Further challenging this idea that we can demand that somebody proves themselves worthy of generosity, because the true generosity is sort of respecting the dignity of the individual. The next chapter is on eating and drinking. So Almustafa says, "Since you must kill to eat, and rob the newly born of its mother's milk to quench your thirst, let it then be an act of worship, and let your board stand an altar on which the pure and innocent of forest and plain are sacrificed, for that which is purer and still more innocent in man." He's recognizing the sacredness of how we as humans receive our sustenance. Eating involves taking a life for most of us. So he's sort of calling us to have this reverence for all living things and hoping to sort of instill this aspect of mindful consumption. And I think that this is actually very relevant and important today in the modern world, probably even much more important in the modern world today, because today we are so far removed from the death involved in the food that ends up on our plate. Most of us buy our food from a grocery store. So we are completely removed, completely separated from the process of taking a life in order to sustain ourselves. Most of us probably don't even think of the animal, right? When we're eating a steak or we're eating a piece of chicken or a piece of fish, we're probably not even thinking about the fact that it was an animal. Like, you're eating the flesh of an animal. An animal was raised and killed, and a part of its body was cut off and placed into a plastic styrofoam package that was sent to a store, and you went and bought that package, and now you're eating it. It's always important to remember and have that mindful aspect integrated into your eating, and to recognize that it is sacred and that life was lost so that you can eat this. I think the same thing applies for when we're eating plants, right? You buy an apple from the store, you buy carrots from the store. You were not at all involved with what was required in order to get those plants onto your table. You're completely removed from that. This concept actually relates to something that we discussed in a previous episode, episode 9, which was on the book Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. If you don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, he was a very great and powerful person, the emperor of Rome. Marcus actually says something quite similar. When you have a piece of fish on your plate, on your table in front of you, say to yourself, this is the dead body of a fish. Like this is an animal's carcass on my table that I'm eating. So just be more connected to it and more mindful of it. Now, after Almustafa speaks to them about eating and drinking, a plowman says, speak to us of work. And Almustafa says, you work that you may keep pace with the earth and the soul of the earth. For to be idle is to become a stranger unto the seasons, and to step out of life's procession that marches in majesty and proud submission towards the infinite. So if you're not working, you're essentially becoming stagnant. You're being idle. You need to keep pace with the earth and the soul of the earth by doing your work and making your contribution to society or to humanity or to your community. You're sort of stepping out of society. You're stepping out of the natural pace of the earth if you're becoming idle. Again, this is similar to something Marcus Aurelius says, discussed in episode 9 of this podcast. He's having trouble sort of getting out of bed and motivating himself to get up and get to work. And one of the things that he says is to look at nature, look outside, look at the trees growing, look at the birds flying around, look at the little insects. He says every single part of nature works. It does its part. So why are you any different? You are not meant to be lazy and spend all day sitting in this comfy, warm bed. You are meant to get up and do your job, play your role, and do your work. Gibran also writes here, always have you been told that work is a curse and labor a misfortune. I'm sure a lot of us can probably relate to that. You're like, oh, I hate to work, or I live for the weekend, or I don't live to work, I work to live. But he says, but I say to you that when you work, you fulfill a part of earth's furthest dream, assigned to you when that dream was born. And in keeping with labor, you are in truth loving life. He's really countering this age-old idea that work is just bleh, or pure drudgery, right? Instead, he's saying that work is really an integral part of our purpose, our place in the universe. No matter what you do, give it your all, put your heart into it, even if it's not something that you want to be doing. Be the best, whatever it is that you can be. This actually reminds me of something that was said in a previous episode 13, where I interviewed Ali Beydoun, a small business owner in Detroit. He owns a pizzeria, and he gives this same advice. He came here as an immigrant when he was about 17 years old, and he really worked his way up from the bottom. He did a lot of other things to try and sort of build himself up and make himself a capable human being. And now he's a very successful business owner. And this is the advice that he gave to young people. Whatever you're going to be, it doesn't matter if you're doing some very basic entry-level job, or if you're, I think he says, if you're a physicist at like the highest level, you be the best damn person at that job that you can possibly be, where you're really, really engaged in your work and you're just feeling so drawn into it and pulled towards it. It's a feeling that is very difficult to explain. In contrast, when you're really like begrudgingly doing your work or having negative feelings towards it, anticipation, Sunday comes around, you're like, oh God, here we go. I got to get ready for work again. It's such a different feeling than when you're actually feeling super excited and you're willing to put in more of your effort, more of your time, more of your energy. He then has what is a bit of an iconic line from this book after that. And he says, work is love made visible. So this is essentially saying that the ultimate expression of love is to pour your heart, to pour your soul into your work, your labor, some sort of creative or constructive or intellectual outlet. And like I said, this is a classic quote from this book that's really emphasizing the synergy of passion and productivity. The next section of the book starts with a woman saying, speak to us of joy and sorrow. And this is a very clear duality that the author Gibran presents to us. He says, your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the selfsame well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. So he's essentially saying that sorrow and joy exist hand in hand. They are inextricably linked. Something that was once a delight to us can be the source of our sorrow. You could have a breakup, something that was once causing you joy, and now it's causing you sorrow. You could have the death of a loved one, any sort of heartbreak or loss. We grieve over losing something that once brought us joy. When he gives these metaphors about the cup that holds your wine was burned in the oven, he's essentially also saying that our sorrow or our suffering or our pain can also deepen our capacity for happiness or joy. How else can you fully appreciate when things are good if you've never experienced when things are bad? How else can you truly revel in the joy that you're experiencing and the life that you have if you don't have some remembrance or experience when life was awful? So I think one of the things that he's trying to tell us here is that we shouldn't run away from our sorrow or avoid our sorrow. Perhaps we should embrace it, because whatever it is that's causing you sorrow now, that thing is probably going to ultimately expand your capacity for joy and happiness. Later on, he says, some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. I say to you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. So he's reminding us that we should never see these as two truly separate states, because they are inextricably linked. Even in our happiest moments, sorrow is close by. And likewise, in our saddest moments, joy can just be stirring underneath all of that sadness, ready to bubble up. So he's basically suggesting that there's this continuous flow of sorrow and joy, and there's no such thing as a permanent joy or a permanent sorrow. You can never truly defeat sorrow. You can never permanently keep and retain your joy. Instead, we should have a little bit more of a holistic view of our emotional states, and certainly not to fear or avoid our sorrow. We also should not overly emphasize or prioritize or cling to our joy. We shouldn't be desperate for our joy. Next up, a mason from the city of Orphalese says, speak to us of houses. So Almustafa says, and though of magnificence and splendor, your house shall not hold your secret nor shelter your longing. Our homes shouldn't stifle our spirits. They should expand our spirits. They should encourage our creativity, our sense of wonder. If we're becoming too comfortable, perhaps we can get to a place where our houses are imprisoning us. We're getting locked into our house or locked into a routine, or perhaps we're having a fear of the outside, not wanting to leave the home, not wanting to explore. One thing that stands out to me, one line is, your house shall not be an anchor, but a mast. It's not an anchor that holds you down in one place. It's a mast that is holding up the sail of the ship that allows you to propel. It should be an instrument of growth. We should be very intentional and conscious about how we design our living space. We should design it in a way that is encouraging the type of behavior that we want to emphasize and prioritize and incentivize. Perhaps you want to encourage creativity or productivity or physical fitness, to cook and to eat at home more, or to entertain your guests, to engage with friends and family. We should be intentional about how we design our spaces. And we should have pride in them too. We should keep them organized and clean. We should be happy and proud, and they should make us feel good. The next person that makes a request of Almustafa says, speak to us of clothes. And he says, your clothes conceal much of your beauty, yet they hide not the unbeautiful. So he's saying essentially these external coverings that you're putting on yourself, they're not going to disguise or hide any inner flaws or insecurities that you might have. And so he says, and you seek in your garments the freedom of privacy, but you may find in them a harness and a chain. So he's saying you're looking for the freedom of privacy. You're looking to sort of mask something with your clothing, but you may end up finding that it's holding you back. You may find them restrictive, especially if you rely on them to hide yourself, or if you rely on them to judge other people. You can sort of become a prisoner of appearances or of fashion. Although we're talking about clothing, I think this can also be related to social media. You see on social media this very curated perspective of somebody's life. Every single person on social media is posting the highlights, the best possible things from their perspective of what's going on in their life. It's not really showing your genuine identity. You really can begin to define yourself by this external cover, whether it's your clothing or your social media profile. You may end up losing some authenticity by placing too much value on how you appear to others. After speaking of clothing, a merchant speaks up, says, tell us about buying and selling. So Mustafa responds, "To you the earth yields her fruit, and you shall not want if you but know how to fill your hands. It is in exchanging the gifts of the earth that you shall find abundance and be satisfied. Yet, unless the exchange be in love and kindly justice, it will but lead some to greed and others to hunger." Here he's emphasizing the importance of a fair exchange. If we operate in a world where we have a fair exchange, then the bounty of the earth is essentially enough for all of us, for all of society, all of humanity. I think he's saying that commerce is an essential part of life. But again, that ethical exchange is sort of the key to the societal balance, emphasizing the fairness and mutual benefit in transactions and agreements, and just having a good spirit behind your transactions. He also says, "Suffer not the barren-handed to take part in your transactions, who would sell their words for your labor." What he's saying is, don't pay attention to the people who are producing nothing but attempting to profit, from other people's labor. And he says, "To such men you should say, 'Come with us to the field, or go with our brothers to the sea and cast your net. For the land and the sea shall be bountiful to you, even as to us.'" So those who are trying to profit without actually doing any work, just urge them, join us in some real work, in some genuine labor. You will benefit. You'll have some profit. So really, again, emphasizing the shared abundance if everyone is contributing to the productive work. Then one of the city's judges says, "Speak to us of crime and punishment." From Almustafa. "Oftentimes I have heard you speak of one who commits a wrong as though he were not one of you, but a stranger unto you, and an intruder upon your world. But I say, even as the holy and the righteous cannot rise beyond the highest which is in each one of you, so the wicked and the weak cannot fall lower than the lowest which is in you also." Basically, he's saying that we are all, as a society, collectively responsible for crime or for the acts of the wicked. This is his view. There's no one that is separate from the class of those people who commit crimes. Essentially saying that crime is the collective shadow of our entire society. He sees that we have a shared responsibility in the wrongdoings. Even the people who are not committing crimes, the people who are not doing wrong, they are also in some way responsible. And the reason for that is because of various social and systemic factors and issues and maybe blind spots that occur in our society. He goes even further and paints this in an even more obvious and clear way. And he even says that this may not be easy for you to hear. Right? So he says, "Though the word lie heavy upon your hearts." So this might be hard for you to hear. "The murdered is not unaccountable for his own murder. The robbed is not blameless in being robbed. The righteous is not innocent in the deeds of the wicked." So this just further emphasizes his point that you can't isolate a criminal act from the entire community's responsibility, including the so-called innocent. He's challenging a simplistic view or narrative of just victim offender or victim criminal, by saying that there's this collective, communal complicity in any crime. After the judge asked about crime and punishment, then a lawyer steps up and says, "But what of our laws, master?" He says, "But what of those to whom life is a rock, and the law a chisel with which they would carve it in their own likeness? What of the cripple who hates dancers? What of the ox who loves his yoke and deems the elk and deer of the forest stray and vagrant things? What of the old serpent who cannot shed his skin and calls all others naked and shameless? What shall I say of these save they too stand in the sunlight, but with their backs to the sun? They only see their shadows, and their shadows are their laws." I think here he's offering a criticism of basically those who are seeing laws as an opportunity to sort of carve the world in their own image. They see the law pretty rigidly. If you see the world only through the lens of the law, then the laws can be a bit of a limitation if you cling to them too rigidly. And I think this is him beginning to sort of say to us that there's a difference between morality and legality. I think he's urging people to live by their own higher moral and ethical code beyond the mere legal constraints. Another line, what man's law shall bind you if you break your yoke, but upon no man's prison door? What laws shall fear you if you dance, but stumble against no man's iron chains? And who is he that shall bring you to judgment if you tear off your garment, yet leave it in no man's path? I think if you boil down the essence of what he's saying with those three statements, pose as questions, actually, not really statements, is that if you live freely on your own path and you don't harm anyone else, then a lot of these external laws are going to sort of lose their power and control over you. He's encouraging us to all live a life filled with personal responsibility for these things. Don't just rely on the laws, rely on your own moral code. Obviously, I'm not advocating that we live in a society without laws or without rules, but I think what he's saying is that we don't necessarily need these external rules and laws imposed on us if we already live ethically and morally. The next chapter is on freedom. He says, at the city gate and by your fireside, I have seen you prostrate yourself and worship your own freedom, even as slaves humble themselves before a tyrant and praise him, though he slays them. In the grove of the temple and the shadow of the citadel, I have seen the freest among you wear their freedom as a yoke and a handcuff. I think what he's saying here is that some people that he sees are sort of idolizing this concept of freedom. They're worshiping their own freedom, saying, I'm free, I'm free. But it sounds like he's saying they're doing it in a submissive or just like patting yourself on the back, self-congratulatory type of way. I think he's saying that when you do this, you're actually losing your freedom. You're losing your autonomy. He's saying that I've seen you all claim freedom, but you bow towards that freedom and worship that freedom as if it actually is your external master. It's ironic. You're worshiping freedom. And in that sense, are you truly free? And so I think what he's really doing is criticizing a sense of false freedom. You can remain enslaved by fear or various societal norms, and your freedom can essentially be a facade, and that there actually are other constraints hiding behind this facade that we're calling freedom. Perhaps somebody is controlled by consumerism. Maybe they suffer from addiction. They suffer from poor sleep or lack of discipline. They suffer from seeking social validation, what others think of them. Maybe you look at somebody who's really hit it off as a social media influencer and they've become very successful. And they say, I'm free. But they're shackled by the whims of their audience and what they expect of them. They have to portray themselves a certain way. They have to be constrained within the cage and the brand that they've built for themselves. He writes, you shall be free indeed when your days are not without a care, nor your nights without a want and a grief, but rather when these things girdle your life, and yet you rise above them naked and unbound. So true freedom is coexisting with the harshness of life, with the challenges that life brings to us. You attain freedom when you have mastery over these things and you understand how to navigate them. And you're an integrated, capable, effective person that's able to weave their way through life's challenges. It's not the lack of problems that creates freedom. It's the ability to remain internally unshackled amid the problems. We focus on what is within our control. What can I do to make my life better, to make my family's life better, to make my community better? What is actually in my control within my sphere of influence? Next, a priestess speaks up and says, speak to us of reason and passion. He presents these two as a duality that are both important and both useful. He says we need to be the lovers of all of our elements, embrace and accept every part of ourselves, the intellectual part, the part that desires, and have them work together cohesively. You can't only use one or focus on one and ignore the other. They work together. And that's supported by this next excerpt that I'll read. Your reason and your passion are the rudder and the sails of your seafaring soul. If either your sails or your rudder be broken, you can but toss and drift, or else be held at a standstill in mid-seas. So we need both reason or rationality, which is like, I guess you can think of it as the rudder And we need emotion or passion or spontaneity, which you can think of as the sails. We need both the rudder and the sails to navigate life. If the rudder is broken, which is reason, the sails just take you where they will. Your passion is unchecked. If the sails are broken or damaged or torn, then all you have is rudder. You have no movement. You have nothing to propel you. The rudder, or the reason, helps give you direction, pointing things in the right way, navigating. The sails are movement, progression. You don't want just movement and progression without the ability to control direction. You don't just want the ability to control direction without movement. Both of them are vital for being effective in navigating life. You need analytical and emotional intelligence in decision making. It's possible I'm drawing a bit of a liberty when I consider part of passions to be emotional intelligence, but passion and emotion go well together. So I think if you tap into your feelings and tap into your emotional intelligence, I think these things are kind of related. But, I get to do whatever I want because this is my podcast. So I can interpret things how I like. And that's me using my reason and my passion. Anyways, reason can help shape passion and make it constructive. And passion can help energize reason and light a fire underneath it. The best outcomes you're ever going to have in life are going to come when you use both your mind and your heart. Reason, passion. The next chapter is on pain. A woman spoke, saying, "Tell us of pain." And he said, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding." He's saying pain reveals deeper truths about ourselves, about life, about the world, and it does so by cracking open our protective shell. It challenges us to grow, and he's challenging us to see pain as an opportunity for growth and to not see it as purely negative. A lot of vital lessons can be learned in moments of deep, great pain, like heartbreak or an immense, deep failure, a deep professional failure. You can learn great lessons from that, or from the loss of a loved one. I heard somebody say before that a man does not truly become a man until he experiences the death of his father, and you inherit all of the responsibility, all of the legacy that he had. It's now on your shoulders. You no longer can tap into him as a source of wisdom. You can't rely on him or count on him anymore. It becomes an opportunity or a catalyst for growth, even if it takes you deep, deep, deep down in the process. Pain is a necessary rupture for new life. Life does not exist without pain. There is no such thing. A life without pain is a life that has not been around that long. He says, "Would you accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields? And would you watch with serenity through the winters of your grief?" So he's using metaphor, relating pain and grief to winter. And he says, if you just accept pain as one of the seasons of your heart, if you endure the sorrow of the winter, you can trust that eventually it will lead to spring. We can find meaning in our pain, in our sorrow, in our winter, rather than just pure despair. I like to take on a practice generally in life of journaling and meditation. In moments of pain and sorrow, in my winters, that practice is immensely beneficial to me. Whenever I do it, I find my pain and suffering so much more meaningful, and I'm able to work through it, understand it, analyze it, grow from it, move on from it, improve myself. I'm able to glean wisdom from my hardships. Next, we speak about self-knowledge. Almustafa says, "Your hearts know in silence the secrets of the days and nights, but your ears thirst for the sound of your heart's knowledge. You would know in words that which you have always known in thought." So on self-knowledge, I think he's saying we often intuitively, within ourselves, understand certain truths, even if we've never spoken those truths aloud or those truths have never been spoken to us. However, even though we know them inherently, intuitively, silently, we crave external confirmation or validation. We crave hearing it. The truth is, we hold inner wisdom within us, and sometimes we fail to trust that inner wisdom until it's expressed by others, or sometimes until it's expressed by us, or somehow validated externally. We're seeking to articulate or somehow make intangible truths tangible, but we already sense them internally. Self-knowledge is often something that we feel or we intuit before it's actually put into language, before we speak it into reality. Often we know what our own dreams and aspirations are. We know them in our heart, in our soul, in our minds. But we yearn, we crave to have some sort of manifestation in real life of them. We wait, we seek, instead of trusting what we intuitively understand and know. We wait for a sign. This is something else that journaling can help with. Meditation, journaling, or artistic activities, expression, painting, drawing, singing, poetry, creative writing of any kind, or any type of conversation. If you speak honestly about your inner truth, somehow into the external world. Podcasts can help with this. We're all humans. The truth is, if you've had a thought, more than likely somebody else has had that same thought. There's just been too many people before us and alive right now for the vast, overwhelming majority of any thought that anyone will ever have to be a brand new thought. So hearing conversations from people in podcasts or reading books can help make the internal things a little bit more tangible for us as well. Another thing he says on self-knowledge is, say not, I have found the truth, but rather I have found a truth. Say not, I have found the path of the soul. Say rather, I have met the soul walking upon my path. He's saying there's no single, final, absolute truth for any one individual. Wisdom or self-knowledge is an ever-evolving thing. He's also suggesting that we should have intellectual humility. We should never feel that we've found the truth. It's an unfolding, evolving experience. We should stay curious. Curiosity is such an important thing for all people of all ages, especially the young, but of all ages. Avoid falling into dogmatism. Remain open to ideas. Remain open to growth. Remain open to change. Remain open to improvement. Remain open to the idea that you might be wrong, that you might be doing something suboptimally, that someone else may know more about something than you. Even if you're on paper more of an expert or have more knowledge or more experience, you may still learn something from someone else. Be humble. The next chapter begins with a teacher saying, speak to us of teaching. Almustafa, the prophet, says, no man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. He's saying, you can't teach something to somebody, something which isn't already somehow within you or dormant within you. All a teacher can do is awaken something that was within you. They can't teach you something that is not already somehow subconsciously present or lying asleep within your own knowledge. Essentially, the teacher's job is to awaken the inner potential that we have. Teaching is really about facilitation. A teacher cannot fill an empty vessel. They can only facilitate you filling your own vessel. And I think this is a useful perspective in modern education and mentoring. The way to teach is to guide others to discover their own insights. I taught a 6-month course on full-stack web development. It was a boot camp. And the students, for the most part, did not have any prior experience in software engineering or programming or computer science or anything like that. There's no way I can teach them everything that I have in my head. All I could do is guide them and help them study. And I made it very clear to them, if all you do is attend my lectures and listen to me, you're not going to learn anything. It's going to be very minimal. You're not going to take away much. The only way you're going to learn is if you dedicate way more time than you do in listening to my lectures in your own self-study. I can't really teach you this stuff. I can explain it to the best of my ability. I can use examples from my experience and my education to bring things down to your level in a compassionate, empathetic way. But I can't teach you something that you don't know and you don't invest yourself into. He uses some more examples or metaphors here. He says, the astronomer may speak to you of his understanding of space, but he cannot give you his understanding. It's exactly what I was just saying. You can't transfer comprehension, true comprehension and understanding directly. Everyone's experience is personal. Knowledge is partially intellectual, but it's partially experiential. I can't download my knowledge into another person. If you don't do your own hands-on self-directed learning, self-study, you are not going to truly learn. After speaking on teaching, a youth says, speak to us of friendship. Almustafa says, your friend is your needs answered. He is your field which you sow with love and reap with thanksgiving. And he is your board and your fireside. For you come to him with your hunger and you seek him for peace. He's saying that friendship is a relationship of mutual nourishment, where you meet each other's needs. A true friend will fulfill our needs without us explicitly demanding or asking for our needs to be filled. Our friendships should be built on shared growth. I'm sure some of you have heard the saying, you are the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with most. True friendships involve sharing of both your struggles and your triumphs. This actually relates to something. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. If he must know the ebb of your tide, let him know its flood also. So the ebb of the tide representing struggles and the flood representing triumphs. He also says, when you part from your friend, grieve not, for that which you love most in him may be clearer in his absence, as the mountain to the climber is clearer from the plain. So sometimes when you're separated from your friends physically, that can bring some clarity to the relationship and some appreciation to your friend's value in your life. The last thing I'll say about what he says on friendship is he says, and let there be no purpose in friendship save the deepening of the spirit. Real true friendship should have an aim of spiritual, emotional enrichment. It's a bond that helps you foster a deeper understanding of life for both of you. After friendships, a scholar says, speak of talking. Almustafa says, you talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. And when you can no longer dwell in the solitude of your heart, you live in your lips, and sound is a diversion and a pastime. And in much of your talking, thinking is half murdered. Sometimes silence can be more meaningful than forced speech. Idle talk can sometimes hinder your true reflection. A few years ago, I was in a program focusing on startups. It was a startup accelerator program in Detroit. Each group was assigned a mentor, and I was practicing my pitch. Obviously, I was doing a lot of speaking. And in part of the practicing, I was speaking and talking, and then eventually my speaking would kind of slow down and I would start to think. I was just kind of mumbling along and trying to squeeze out a few more words, talking for the sake of continuing to speak. And the mentor told me, you don't need to keep talking when you've already made your point. You can just let it be. You're speaking clearly, you're speaking eloquently, and then suddenly you get to the point where you're pausing more and you're having to think a lot harder about the words that you're saying and just trying to come up with something. That means you're done talking. You've said what you need to say. Instead of just continuing to squeeze out more words because you feel like you need to talk to fill the space, just stop talking. You answered the question. You said what you needed to say. You made your statement. If something was on my mind, if I had something to get out, it would just come out. It would flow naturally. But if I get to the point now where I'm like trying to say words, it's like that means I'm done. It means I don't have anything else to say and I don't need to keep rambling. And he also said, for thought is a bird of space. And when you put it in a cage of words, it can still unfold its wings, but it cannot fly. So he's saying ideas are vast and words can limit the vastness of those ideas. Even if those words are helping you to partially express your ideas, it's limited. So he cautions us on over-talking or over-verbalizing, and that doing so might lose the essence of a deeper truth. So we should be mindful in our speech. We should think, is this speech enhancing my clarity or is it stifling it? Then an astronomer said, "Master, what of time?" The timeless in you is aware of life's timelessness and knows that yesterday is but today's memory and tomorrow is today's dream. I think he's saying our inner being, our inner self, is connected to something well beyond the clock time that we all know and relate to and utilize. It's something more eternal and universal, beyond the linear constraints of how we perceive time, past, present, future. But he does encourage us to be mindful to live in the present. This is a bit of a brief chapter, but one of the things that it made me think about is oftentimes when people think about the past, they're thinking about regrets, the things they wish they would have done or would have done differently or didn't do. And then when you think about the future, you're thinking about your anxieties and things that you're worried about happening. So we should try to probably focus on the present for the most part and be a little bit mindful on how we can handle these things in a little bit more of a constructive way. One of the other things that I said in a previous episode 2, on The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker, is that solving problems involves thinking about the past because it was past behavior that created a problem today. And focusing on opportunities is about thinking about the future. These are the things that come to mind for me. Let's move on to the next chapter, which begins with one of the elders of the city saying, "Speak to us of good and evil." Gibran writes, "What is evil but good tortured by its own hunger and thirst?" What he's saying here, that evil is a corrupted, distorted good that's resulting from the unmet needs that we have. He's implying a bit of compassion for those who do wrong. He sees them as basically fallen from what their own potential is. Oftentimes, someone's negative behavior is stemming from some deeper wound that they have. He then makes a series of statements encouraging a non-dualistic approach to understanding good and evil. You are good when you are one with yourself. Yet, when you are not one with yourself, you are not evil. For a divided house is not a den of thieves. It is only a divided house. So if we have a lack of alignment, it might just be a symptom of disconnection or confusion, some sort of inner conflict, but it's not necessarily from some sort of inherent evil or wickedness. When he says, when you are one with yourself, that is good. So that's a sense of wholeness. Your values are consistent with your actions. Your actions support and are in line with your values. But if you have someone who contradicts themselves, it doesn't mean that they're evil. It might just simply mean that they're in the process of learning or figuring it out. He says, a ship without a rudder may wander aimlessly among perilous isles, yet sink not to the bottom. So if you're lacking your clear direction, it doesn't necessarily mean you're headed to destruction. He also says, you are good when you strive to give of yourself, yet you are not evil when you seek to gain for yourself. Giving and receiving are both natural human needs. It's not necessary to condemn those who take to sustain themselves. Now, we don't want to take it to the point of exploitation, but it's not necessarily evil to seek for yourself. He also says you are good when you are fully awake in your speech, yet you are not evil when you sleep while your tongue staggers without purpose. And even stumbling speech may strengthen a weak tongue. You are good when you walk to your goal firmly and with bold steps, yet you are not evil when you go thither limping. Even those who limp go not backward. He's saying that if we're lacking clarity or strength, it doesn't mean that's a moral failing. He's distinguishing between being not perfect and then being truly evil. And we shouldn't view our shortcomings as evil. Mistakes or slow progress, and sometimes even backwards progress, they're all part of being human. I can take this advice. I have high expectations of myself. And when I don't meet these expectations, I come down hard on myself. And I become very, very self-critical and negative. The last thing I'll say about good and evil, he says, in your longing for your giant self lies your goodness. What he says is that your real goodness arises from your striving to be your best self. That is good. We shouldn't compare ourselves to the pace and abilities of others. You compare yourself to who you were yesterday and how you can be better today. And then you focus on how tomorrow you can be better than you were today. next we hear again from a priestess saying, "Speak to us of prayer. You pray in your distress and in your need. Would that you might pray also in the fullness of your joy and in your days of abundance. For what is prayer but the expansion of yourself into the living ether? And if it is for your comfort to pour your darkness into space, it is also for your delight to pour the dawning of your heart." So prayer, which you can think of it as prayer, or you can think of it as mindfulness or meditative practices, or thinking about something, being in your thoughts. But whatever it is, prayer, as he describes it, is some sort of relation or communication or connection to the universe. It's some way for you to expand yourself into the living ether. And he says it shouldn't merely be a cry for help when you're having a crisis. Why wouldn't you also pray when you're joyous? He says, think of it just holistically as you expanding yourself into the universe, into the living ether. So he invites us to connect spiritually in moments of both sorrow and in gratitude and in joyfulness. Pray on your blessings as well as praying on your hardships and your desires. Next, he's asked about pleasure. How he discusses pleasure is he speaks of it from the perspective of youth, elders, and then some people in between. So he says, "Some of your youth seek pleasure as if it were all, and they are judged and rebuked. I would not judge nor rebuke them. I would have them seek, for they shall find pleasure, but not her alone." So he's saying that some young people are chasing pleasure naively, as if it were the most important thing. And he said, let them seek pleasure. They're going to find pleasure, but they're going to find other things too, things that they weren't seeking. And then he says, "And some of your elders remember pleasures with regret, like wrongs committed in drunkenness. But regret is the beclouding of the mind and not its chastisement. They should remember their pleasures with gratitude, as they would the harvest of a summer." So now he's saying, whereas the youth might seek pleasure like it's the most important thing, some of the elders might feel sort of guilt or shame or regret when they think back on acts that they committed in the seeking of pleasure. So in both of these scenarios, he's saying, don't judge the young for seeking pleasure, and don't judge yourself for seeking pleasure in the past when you're old. And then he goes to the in-betweens, in between the youth and the old. "And there are among you those who are neither young to seek nor old to remember. And in their fear of seeking and remembering, they shun all pleasures, lest they neglect the spirit or offend against it. But even in the foregoing is their pleasure." So he's saying some that are not too young and not too old are seeking to avoid pleasure. They fear the pleasure may conflict with their spiritual or moral beliefs or priorities. Ironically, even in denying themselves pleasure, they find pleasure. So there's some form of hidden gratification, even in the practice of trying to avoid pleasure or thinking that pleasure is something that is wrong. I think what he's trying to say is that everyone in some way is pursuing some kind of pleasure, even if you actively try to avoid or abstain from it. Then a poet asks him to speak to them on beauty. And he says, "Beauty is not a need, but an ecstasy. It is not a mouth thirsting, nor an empty hand stretched forward, but rather a heart inflamed and a soul enchanted." It's an ecstasy, he says, beauty is. This uplifted state. He said it's not a need, so it's not some way to remediate something that you lack, but it's an overflow of wonder and awe in appreciating a piece of art or experiencing nature or experiencing a state of flow when doing something that is close to your soul, that's important to you. You can experience flow in working on a podcast, for example, or you can experience flow when you're working on something at work, or even if you're just cleaning the house, doing dishes. You're in this flow state. That's beautiful. True beauty is spiritual and internally resonant. It's not some external phenomenon outside of ourselves. It's transcendent of these external forms. Intangible, beyond visuals, beyond sounds. It is the recognition and the observation and the understanding of the wonder of everyday life. Then an old priest asks him to speak on religion. And he says, "Have I spoken this day of aught else? Is not religion all deeds and all reflection? And that which is neither deed nor reflection, but a wonder and a surprise ever springing in the soul, even while the hands hew the stone or tend the loom? Who can separate his faith from his actions, or his belief from his occupations? Who can spread his hours before him, saying, "This is for God, and this for myself, this for my soul, and this other for my body"? He's basically saying that all of his teachings all revolve around spirituality. Every aspect of life, everything he's been talking about today, is religion. It's not some separate compartment that religion lies in. Religion is all-encompassing. He has this holistic perspective that spiritual practice is embedded in your daily tasks, in your work, how you deal with your children, in your marriage, in buying and selling, in how you express joy and sorrow, in your interaction with your friends, your emotions, how you reason things, your relationships. He encourages us to see everything that we do as acts of devotion. And here he's rejecting a dualistic mindset that lumps some parts of life as holy and other parts of life as earthly. I said at the beginning of the episode that he doesn't confine his discussion on spirituality to any particular religion. He's not confining it to any particular ritual or dogma. And he's encouraging and understanding that the spiritual values that people have are going to inform the daily work that they do and how they live their life and the decisions that they make. Every moment is this holy experience, and you should carry that full presence into your daily tasks. So he's asking us to sort of reframe the chores that we have to do, the jobs that we have to do, the errands that we have to do, the responsibilities that we have, in a way that we can approach them mindfully and think of them in this sacred or spiritual way. Finally, on the last chapter where people are asking him questions, there's one chapter after that where he addresses them, but on the second to last chapter of the entire book, Almitra speaks up again, and she says, "We would now ask of death." He says, "You would know the secret of death, but how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide onto the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one." So here he's urging us to really approach and understand death as a part of life. And you're able to discover this through living fully. Open your heart wide onto the body of life. You don't learn about death by escaping life. You learn about death by diving deeper into the essence of life. He says, "In the depth of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond." The yearnings that we have, these desires and hopes that we have, hint that there is something beyond this life that we're living. I'm not speaking for personal beliefs. This is what it says in the book. I do believe that we should approach death as a part of life. It is the natural way. And I encourage you all to embrace life vigorously and passionately. And I think that is the true path to understanding mortality. You or anyone that you know are not guaranteed that you're going to live to 90 and die peacefully in your bed. You could go at any time. There's no guarantee that I'm going to finish recording this podcast before I die. It's completely out of your control. If you have that clear, solid understanding of your mortality and that reminder that death is not something that's guaranteed or promised to come after a long-lived, fulfilled life, that it could literally happen at any time, it motivates you to live your life in a certain way and do the things that are actually important to you. There's an app that I like called WeCroak. At 5 random times throughout the entire day, it will send a notification on your phone. The notification says something along the lines of, "Remember that you will die." And every time I get that reminder, remembering that I will die, forces me to reflect on what I'm actually doing in that moment and if it is actually the thing that I want to be doing or if there's something else that I'd rather be doing. So those are the chapters where he is accepting prompts and questions from the people of Orphalese. The final chapter is titled The Farewell. He's like, all right, we're done, right? In case you forgot what the beginning of this podcast was, he was at the city for 12 years and his ship finally came to take him back home. And he was ready to go. Then all of the people sort of crowded him and said, wait, please, we don't want you to leave. And Almitra says, please tell us about some wisdom about life. And they asked him all these questions and he responded. Now, the last chapter, telling them farewell. It opens with actually Al-Mitra saying, "Blessed be this day and this place and your spirit that has spoken." Al-Mustafa replies, "Was it I who spoke? Was I not also a listener?" This kind of represents Al-Mustafa's humility in being a teacher. He's sort of crediting it as a synergy between the speakers and the listeners. He didn't just say, "Okay, I'm going to tell you all this stuff." He said, "What's in your hearts? What's in your minds? What do you want to know about? You guide me." And then he just responded to them. So he's suggesting that wisdom here is emerging from this shared space that they all created. He didn't play the role of this singular, elevated oracle that just told them all these things. He said, "What do you want to know about?" Any sort of meaningful dialogue is going to be a two-way channel. It's not just one person dictating. Even if you have this wise teacher, they can also learn from the audience. One of the best ways to learn is by teaching. Seems paradoxical, but it's true. And it's also an important lesson for leadership. Listening is part of speaking effectively and communicating effectively. Even if you're guiding people, you're always a student. You're their student as much as they are your student. So he says, "People of Orphalese, the wind bids me leave you. Less hasty am I than the wind, yet I must go." So he says, it's time to go. It's time for me to leave. I'm a little bit reluctant, but really it's time for me to go. And he says, "Brief were my days among you, and briefer still the words have I spoken. But should my voice fade in your ears, and my love vanish in your memory, then I will come again, and with a richer heart and lips more yielding to the Spirit will I speak." So he's emphasizing how fleeting his words could be. He's sort of suggesting what he said about talking, which is that the essence of what he offered them can't really be fully contained in words. And then he says, "If aught I have said is truth, then truth shall reveal itself in a clearer voice and in words more kin to your thoughts." So he's saying that the wisdom that he's offered them is transcending his physical presence there. The truth that he's shared with them is going to endure beyond his time there, beyond him as a messenger. And he says to them, if my voice fades, even if you forget what I've taught you, if you forget the lessons, they're going to return when you're ready to receive them again. And sort of encouraging this trust that if there was anything that he said that involved genuine insight, it will resurface in due time, and that other teachers may appear in new forms. He then says, "You have been told that even like a chain, you are as weak as your weakest link. This is but half the truth. You are also as strong as your strongest link." So here he's saying we shouldn't purely define ourselves by our limitations, because we should also define ourselves by our greatness. Yeah, you're as weak as your weakest link, but we have a shared strength. We are also as good as the best of us, as much as we are as weak as the weak of us. He then says, "I only speak to you in words of that which you yourselves know in thought. And what is word knowledge but a shadow of wordless knowledge?" Again, he's calling back and reflecting on all these teachings that he had from before, just sort of summarizing all these things for them. "Your thoughts and my words are waves from a sealed memory that keeps records of our yesterday, and of the ancient days when the earth knew not us nor herself, and of the nights when earth was upwrought with confusion." He's clarifying that he's not feeding them new information. He's awakening something that they already sense. They have a sealed memory, referencing a collective ancient body of knowledge shared by all of humanity. He's not teaching them anything new. He says, "It is life in quest of life in bodies that fear the grave. There are no graves here. Whenever you pass by the field where you have laid your ancestors, look well thereupon, and you shall see yourselves and your children dancing hand in hand." He's stressing that we need to seek more life within our mortal bodies, go deeper into life when we think about death. And he says there are no graves here, which I sort of take to mean that he's basically saying that there's an afterlife, that on a spiritual level, there's no final death or end to it all. He thinks life transcends what we see as ending in the grave. He's being sort of poetic when he says, in the same place that we bury our loved ones, there's this ongoing timeless dance that's happening across generations. He's challenging this idea of being separated from our ancestors and that we're all interconnected, and that there's this sort of spiritual continuity, and that the ancestors remain part of us and they're woven into the interconnectedness of everything. He also says, "You have given me my deeper thirsting after life. Surely there is no greater gift to a man than that which turns all his aims into parching lips and all of life into a fountain. And in this lies my honor and my reward, that whenever I come to the fountain to drink, I find the living water itself thirsty, and it drinks me while I drink it. He's saying that the audience, the people of the town of Orphalese, have nourished his own thirst for life. So there's a mutual nourishment, a reciprocal relationship. It's not a passive dynamic. They're meeting halfway. When he says, I drink the living water, it drinks me while I drink it, you can also think of this metaphor as like work that you're passionate about, perhaps a creative work. Let's say you're writing a great novel. You're seeking out how to write this story, but it's also seeking you. If you listen to episodes 4, 5, and 6 of this podcast, that's a 3-part series on the book, The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And it's a book for creatives and artists dealing with procrastination, resistance, and how to handle approaching your work. And in that, he gets quite spiritual, talking about how you're inspired by the muse and you come to it and the work comes to you and you're not really creating it. It's just coming into your head and you're the vessel for it. I think that applies to work generally if you're just working on a project that you really care about. He also says, for this I bless you most. You give much and know not that you give at all, saying that the people have been unconsciously generous to him and they're providing kindness or inspiration to him without them even meaning to or realizing it. I think this kind of relates to something I said earlier in the episode. You never know what sort of impact you might have on somebody with just random acts of kindness. And he says, if these be vague words, then seek not to clear them. Vague and nebulous is the beginning of all things, but not their end. So he's sort of saying, if things are vague or they're not making sense, don't worry too much about it. Be comfortable in accepting that there are some things that are unknown or that aren't super clear. Then he also says, what was given us here we shall keep. And if it suffices not, then again must we come together and together stretch our hands onto the giver. What he's basically saying is that knowledge and wisdom is an ongoing thing. It doesn't start and end with me coming and leaving. If it's incomplete, you end up gaining more knowledge. This is the most extensive chapter of the book. I'm skipping a lot of it from the farewell. The last thing that I'll say that Almustafa says, forget not that I shall come back to you. A little while, and my longing shall gather dust and foam for another body. A little while, a moment of rest upon the wind, and another woman shall bear me. So it's essentially saying that he's going to return in some other form or some other time, or perhaps not even him, perhaps just the spirit of wisdom or his teachings will resurface somehow. It can reemerge in future contexts, new generations, other teachers. Finally, the last thing that I'm going to read. This is the closing lines of the book. Only Almitra was silent, gazing after the ship until it had vanished into the mist. And when all the people were dispersed, she still stood alone upon the sea wall, remembering in her heart his saying, a little while, a moment of rest upon the wind, and another woman shall bear me. So it just suggests that she's sort of internalizing this promise that he's making. She must believe in that continuity that he's talking about. Maybe she's going to be the new teacher or the new prophet, or maybe she just sees the potential for future growth or future manifestations of growth or truth. Anyways, that is the book. Obviously didn't read all of it. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I've truly enjoyed reading it myself. I've truly enjoyed breaking it down and analyzing it to share with you in this podcast episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to rate the podcast up to 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to. And sometimes there's also the option to write a review, which would be great. I would also greatly appreciate if you connected with us on social media. On Instagram, we're at So-Called Discoveries. Connect with us on LinkedIn as well. All the platforms, you can find links to get all that stuff in the show notes. Send an email if you'd like to get in touch. Let me know what you think, what you thought of the episode, if it was useful for you. Again, I truly appreciate the time that you've put into listening. I hope that I've been able to provide some value, and I hope that you have learned something. Bye for now.